Hey there, and welcome back to Rowing with the Homies. I'm your host, Finlos, and I'm so glad that you're here with me today. On this show, we explore the deep connection between big ideas, current events, and our personal, mental, and physical health. We talk about the inner work, the quiet, disciplined effort that makes the external movements of our lives meaningful. Today, I want to talk about governance, and it's an ongoing conversation that I've been having. Unfortunately, with the current status of how things are unfolding in the United States, it's something that I feel I need to talk about a lot, just as a means of coping with the general unrest that is currently the status quo of this country. But also just from a philosophical, from a academic, from a thought problem sort of perspective, governing and governance is one of the most, if not the most, complex and collaborative form of human organization. And I want to talk about what happens when the organization, the movement stops, and how what is required of governance, compromise, and to be truthful, compromise sometimes is an inconvenience. But what happens when compromise is being replaced by aggression, and even maybe a symbolic, a figurative hostage taking? And so I'm going to be kind of unpacking, exploring fair and representational governments and how they, in theory, should account for all citizens, even when there is disagreement, and thus allowing for the levers of power and influence, even for minority parties, for those parties and for those groups not in power, to have some say and some influence on what is happening. And I think more importantly, what happens when those levers of influence are replaced by levers of control, levers of destruction. A political party that says, if I, or if my group, if my party can't have it our way, then no one can do anything. Nobody gets anything. Except that party in power still ends up getting things. So we're going to look at the recent government shutdown, which essentially just ended yesterday, in the United States, and use it as a lens to explore the difference between a party asserting its voice and a party asserting its dominance. We'll look at the history of using how the government functions as a political weapon, and then we'll broaden out to talk about the global rise of authoritarian trends and the historical importance of allowing the minority to be heard. And we'll begin again with the specific event that is at the forefront of this conversation, which is the recent government shutdown here in the United States, because it provides a perfect metaphor for the difference between struggle and sabotage. Governing is, by its very nature, a struggle. It requires compromise. It requires negotiation and the often uncomfortable acceptance of limitations, of limits and boundaries. A minority party, by design, should have mechanisms, and does have mechanisms, to express itself and assert its limited power. In this specific situation, The majority party, the Republicans, which control the House, they hold a majority in the Senate, they run the executive branch, and for all intents and purposes, the Supreme Court is dominated by Republican-appointed judges. The Republicans refuse to negotiate on the legislative priorities of the Democratic minority. Really, it was just one issue, and that is the extension of the Affordable Care Act, or the ACA, premium tax credits, which are set to expire, threatening millions of Americans with rising healthcare costs. The Republican position was that they would not even begin to discuss this issue until the government reopened. Of course, the Democrats have been trying to discuss and negotiate this for years, but as the minority party have lacked the necessary votes to move through. The Democratic minority was thus left with very few levers of influence. Their main tool has been the Senate filibuster, which requires 60 votes to pass most funding legislation. And by withholding the votes needed to reach that 60-vote threshold, Democrats use the government shutdown as their one major high-stakes negotiating tactic, a dramatic, inconvenient form of asserting their limited power to try to force the majority back to the negotiating table. And this political standoff, while massive in scale, is a perfect macro illustration of a breakdown in interpersonal governance. It becomes a relationship shutdown when the primary goal is no longer moving forward, but forcing compliance. The majority party's refusal to even negotiate on the ACA subsidies, their core mandate, until their terms were met, is a form of stonewalling. In a heated argument, stonewalling is when one person completely shuts down. They won't talk, they won't make eye contact, they won't even acknowledge the other person's priorities. That is the refusal to negotiate. Using silence and institutional paralysis as a weapon to demand the other party capitulate to their emotional or procedural terms first. And this is perfectly illustrated by Speaker of the House Johnson dismissing the House of Representatives for the entirety of the shutdown. No negotiations were happening on the House side. There was no conversation. The House was closed for business. And it could be argued that it was the Democrats who were holding the entirety of Congress hostage. But what is a group to do when all other levers of power have been removed? When the legislation is brought before Congress and all members agree that healthcare is important, and yet there is no recognition of the need. Blocking the funding is a tool, and it was used. And the history of using the budget as leverage is mixed, but for the minority, it temporarily forces the majority to acknowledge their existence. However, the minority's power in this situation proved to be fleeting and fragile. The ultimate outcome provided a stark example of that fragility. 8 moderate Democrats and 1 independent senator ultimately broke ranks and voted with the Republicans to advance the funding measure. This was seen by party leaders as a surrender that erased the leverage that they had fought for. This political failure is the interpersonal moment when you abandon your moral or emotional leverage out of exhaustion or fear of the pain of the standoff. In therapy, you might finally set a firm boundary with a difficult family member. It causes chaos and distress. After weeks of silent, painful standoff, you cave and call them just to end the immediate crisis. You traded your long-term demand for respect for the short-term relief of ending the chaos. You reinforced that your leverage, your boundary, has an expiration date, and the aggressor just needs to wait you out. This kind of political strategy, where the majority's power is absolute and the minority's voice is crushed, moves beyond negotiation and into an exercise of punitive, centralized power. There were discussions and attempts, notably supported by President Trump, to fire federal employees during the shutdown, fundamentally politicizing the nonpartisan civil service. The suggestion of deploying the so-called nuclear option, a procedural move that eliminates the minority party's filibuster, is a direct threat to eliminate one of the only true levers of power the minority has, suggesting a philosophy of total dominance over reasoned debate. And as the shutdown dragged on, the real-world consequences became alarmingly apparent, with fears of FAA restrictions due to understaffed air traffic control and a lack of safety oversight, suggesting the entire mechanism of the country began to seize up. The underlying issue here is the majority's refusal to accept struggle. Governing is hard. Governing requires accepting limits and confronting unconfrontable truths. And confronting uncomfortable truths. The performative outrage and the demands for absolute victory, the my way or the highway mentality, is an attempt to replace that hard, scary work with a temporary adrenaline rush of dominance. This refusal to acknowledge the fundamental necessity of the other side, of the minority party, of the dissenting voice, is a rejection of the democratic rhythm itself. And even the arguments that those Democrats who ended up voting with the Republicans to reopen the government argue that their position was that they are listening to the struggles of their constituents, that they are opening the government to ease that discomfort that those who are experiencing flight delays or flight cancellations or who are not receiving paychecks because of government furloughs, they were easing those discomforts. And maybe that's true, but the messaging becomes from the majority party, the Republicans, that they were weak. It was their fault to begin with. And finally, they're admitting that and acquiescing to our demands. And there is this pitiful so-called promise of a conversation about healthcare, but there are no guarantees of any extension of those benefits. And that gets me thinking. The core thesis, the main tenet of a truly representative republic is that it is a slow, complex, and inconvenient mechanism. It is intentionally designed to be inefficient, precisely because that inefficiency forces the consideration of the minority's view. And this philosophical principle holds true for every healthy system. Empathy is inconvenient. Compromise means slowing down your personal agenda and accepting friction to respect someone else's considerations and needs. And the failure of leadership at all the levels of government to maintain this process, when a speaker like Mike Johnson allows his legislative agenda to be dictated by a tiny, ultra-conservative faction within his own party, it is a failure of his responsibility as speaker and a failure of the institutional responsibility of the legislative branch of government. And it's more than a simple moral failure. It's a systemic one. It's been observed that all large organizations, even democratic ones, inevitably tend to be controlled by a small organized elite. And this is referred to as the iron law of oligarchy. It suggests that in the absence of disciplined institutional practice, which is what we're experiencing, and in the absence of strong leadership that protects the process, power naturally flows to the loud, organized, and uncompromising few, regardless of how few of them there are. And the ensuing chaos makes the final product, or the resulting legislation, worse, because true, diverse expertise was dissolved by the leader's fear of confrontation. The historical importance of minority parties is not just a matter of fairness, it's a matter of stability. When the minority believes they have no voice, no lever of influence, and no way to slow the actions of a majority they fundamentally oppose, the natural and dangerous move is toward extra-legal action, toward protest, toward civil disobedience, and eventually toward violence. And this ties directly into the global rise of authoritarian trends in countries across the world, from the erosion of democratic norms in places like Hungary and Turkey and Israel, to the rise of populist strongman leaders like Donald Trump. The common tactic is always the same: dismantle or discredit the mechanisms of the opposition. They do not eliminate the opposition itself, they just eliminate its power to govern or to influence. The use of the government shutdown as a weapon is a soft power version of this. It discredits the government as a whole, feeding into the anti-institutional narrative that all politicians are corrupt, and only a powerful singular figure can fix it. At least that's how Donald Trump has been portraying the entire government shutdown. All of this conversation really leads me to the third segment, and how today depression feels like being invisible. The paralysis of the government that we've been discussing, the movement or the moment when the process stops, the mechanisms lock up, and the people running the show prioritize their performative fight over the actual work. It mirrors a feeling I know very intimately when I'm in the midst of the symptoms of depression. I often feel like I'm unseen and like my needs aren't really that important to the larger world. My insignificance becomes very potent. I must have a lot in common in that moment with those civil servants who are not being paid. I'm putting in the effort, trying to keep the lights on, but the systems around me, my body, my mind, my energy, they feel like they're running on fumes because the resources have been withheld, seemingly arbitrarily. The government is closed, and yet the world keeps spinning. The sense of powerlessness in the face of a political system that is literally choosing to stop working mirrors the powerlessness of being let down by your own inner chemistry. The struggle of mental health suddenly feels meaningless. The fear that I'll put in the effort and nothing will remain, not even me. The effort of simply getting out of bed feels like an important piece of legislation that keeps getting vetoed. for purely selfish, performative reasons. A political argument often hinges on the question, what is the lever of power? When the political minority's main lever failed, they had to pivot. The same is true for mental health. When depression hits, my major coping mechanisms, like working out, like cooking a meal, or socializing, often fail. Sometimes because I don't have the energy, sometimes because I feel burnt out, and sometimes it's because it seems like the effort is meaningless and will only lead to further frustration. But we can't declare a shutdown because the world keeps moving. And so the internal work becomes learning to find what is the minimum viable lever I can pull. If the plan is for a 30-minute workout, what might a new, smaller, viable lever be? Today, maybe that lever will simply be 3 minutes of sunlight, or 1 glass of water instead of that extra cup of coffee, or sending out that one text message to a friend I haven't heard from in a while. It's not necessarily the grand win that I had planned for, but it's still a tiny, disciplined act of self-governance, of autonomy, that keeps the essential systems from going entirely dark. It accepts the slow and convenient rhythm as the necessary pace. Of course, the temptation is to retreat into the opposite of that principle, to avoid the struggle entirely, to ignore that need, that desire, and to wait for the symptoms to pass on their own. But maybe the fear of futility is the struggle. And today, depression feels a lot like talking to myself, but in the positive sense that we talked about in a previous episode. It's that internal conversation where I'm not seeking validation from the outside world, and instead I'm accepting my limitations. I am tired, I am moving slowly, and my body, my rhythm is heavy today. And that acceptance is an act of courage, of maintaining the struggle. It is a way of facing imperfection. It is a way of fighting that sense of invisibility, of unimportance. And by accepting the struggle, by letting the frustration of the day not win, and by insisting on a single small act of resistance, I can finally find a way to start hearing that quiet voice of existence again. That internal work of self-acceptance, accepting the messy, flawed, slow growth is the most fundamental way to resist. And as you continue to move through the week, through these days, I have a challenge for you. Identify one of those moments of crisis in your life where it seems like things have broken down. Maybe a conversation that you've been stonewalling, or a boundary that you failed to maintain, or something that you've just let go. And your challenge is to replace that refusal to negotiate with the inconvenience of empathy. Choose the slow, painful process over the quick satisfaction and ease of shutting down. Thank you for spending this time and energy with me. I understand that my experience is mine and does not speak for you. Each of our experiences is different. I encourage you to find community, to reach out to someone who you trust, to speak, to share, to find support. Maybe a friend, maybe a family member, maybe a professional. You are not alone. I'm grateful to every one of you who chooses quiet reflection and who chooses to continue to do the work of reflection and introspection. If you have any comments, questions, or suggestions for future episodes, you can find me on social media, or you can send an email to finlos@finloslives.com. Until next time, stay committed to the process, and I look forward to our next conversation.